Dump it. Dump it right in his face. This old man doesn't deserve a decent meal. The hot bowl of soup was thrown straight into my face, my skin burning, my eyes stinging. I heard my son-in-law chuckle softly. I turned to my daughter. She didn't scream. She didn't rush over. She only said one sentence that made me go cold inside. "He's right, Dad. You should know your place." I didn't fight back. I wiped my face. I stood up, but before I walked out of that house, I did one single thing they never could have expected. If you're listening to this story, tell me where you're listening from. Leave a comment. Hit like if you've ever seen silence mistaken for weakness. My name is Derek. I'm 72 years old. People usually say that at this age, a man only wants peace, dinner with family, the evening news, and an early night. I used to think so too. I believed the last years of my life would pass quietly, with nothing left to prove. But that dinner tore everything apart. It was a suburban house in the northern part of the city, a quiet neighborhood with neatly trimmed lawns and porches glowing with lights every evening. That house wasn't Lucas's, and it certainly wasn't Rachel's. It was the house I paid for more than 10 years earlier, before Rachel ever met Lucas. I remember every plank of flooring, every roof repair after a storm. Every afternoon I stood in the backyard holding the hose, watering the grass, thinking I had done my duty as a father. Lucas entered my daughter's life with a wide smile and words as sweet as honey. And I, in his eyes, was just an outdated old man, dressed simply, driving an old car, never talking about money. He thought I was poor. He was sure of it, and he didn't hide his contempt. At dinner, Lucas talked nonstop, about work, about big opportunities, about how some people needed to keep up with the times. Every sentence was like a small needle aimed straight at me. I didn't interrupt. I ate slowly, listened more than I spoke. I was used to being overlooked. I once believed silence was the best way to keep the peace. Then I made one small, harmless comment about not wasting money on unnecessary things. Lucas set his spoon down. His eyes changed. And then came that sentence, along with the hot soup. The burning on my skin faded quickly. The worst pain was the moment I looked at Rachel. She didn't defend me. She didn't hesitate. She chose her husband's side right in front of me, in my own house. I wiped my face with the paper napkin on the table, slowly, calmly enough to surprise even myself. I didn't yell, I didn't accuse. I stood up, put on my jacket, and walked toward the door. No one stopped me. Lucas even let out a mocking laugh behind my back. Outside, the air was bitter cold. The wind moved through the bare branches, carrying the damp smell of winter. I stood on the front step for a second and looked back at the house. The dining room lights were still on. Inside, they continued their dinner as if I had never existed. I walked down the steps and toward the driveway. My old car was parked there, coated in a thin layer of dust. I opened the door and sat behind the wheel. Before starting the engine, I reached into my coat pocket. Inside was an old phone, the kind without internet. The kind no one pays attention to. I had kept it for years, out of habit, as a last option I hoped I would never have to use. I looked at the screen for a moment. Then I dialed a short sequence of numbers. No hold music, just a few dry, brief rings. "Give the order." The voice on the other end was low and steady. No questions, no surprise, as if this call had been expected for a very long time. I didn't say much, just a few sentences, clear, decisive. When I hung up, my hands were steady. My heart beat evenly. I sat in the car a little longer, looking at the lights in that house. The house I had paid for, the house they thought I only lived in as a freeloader. I started the engine. The car rolled slowly out of the familiar street. In the rearview mirror, the house grew smaller, then disappeared around the corner. They thought I had just lost everything. But that very night, I activated the thing I had sworn I would never use. I drove quite a distance before stopping in the parking lot of a 24-hour supermarket where cold fluorescent lights washed everything in a pale glow. I turned off the engine and sat still, both hands on the steering wheel, feeling the remaining heat on my face finally fade. Inside the car was the smell of my old coat, the cold wind mixed with the lingering scent of soup on my collar. I flipped down the sun visor and looked at my face. A red mark ran across my cheekbone, and a smaller burn had splashed onto my wrist. Not serious, but enough to remind me this wasn't a nightmare. At 72, I had learned to live with dull aches, knees hurting when the weather turned cold, mornings when I had to push myself up from a chair. But being pushed away from the dinner table by my own daughter was what truly hollowed out my chest. I took out the old phone again. The screen showed only a few names, so few that someone might think I had lived a life without friends. I opened the last message I had sent. No long text. Just one short line and a secure email address I hadn't used in a long time. It felt like opening a dust-covered door, a door leading back to a part of my life I had tried to put away. For 5 years, I had lived like a truly poor old father. I stayed in the small back house, originally built as a tool shed and guest room, then renovated into a living space. I drove the old sedan, its windshield scratched, the leather seats cracked. I bought discounted groceries, drank cheap coffee, told neighbors I lived on assistance and a little savings. I let Rachel believe that. I let the whole family believe it, because I wanted to see how they would treat me when I was no longer a useful man. Before that, I wasn't someone who sat still. I used to wake up at 4 a.m., drive the first truck route myself, sign contracts at ports, stand in warehouses during blistering summers, checking every shipment. I was the founder of a transportation and logistics corporation. I sold it years ago. For a number, the newspapers covered page after page. After that deal, I could have lived anywhere, bought anything. But I stepped out of the spotlight. I had seen too many families fall apart over money, so I chose silence, chose to step back, chose to pretend to be poor as a test I kept convincing myself was necessary. I told Rachel I wanted a simple life. I didn't tell old stories. I didn't show anything off. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting her from temptation, from illusion. But slowly, I realized that test didn't just test them. It tested me too. I had turned myself into a shadow in my own house and hoped they would love that shadow. That night, I understood they didn't just fail to love me. They despised me. I opened the car door and went into the supermarket to buy a bottle of water and some bandages for the burn. The cashier looked at me the way you look at a lonely old man. That normal look made it easier to breathe. I sat back in the car, cleaned the burn, took a sip of water, and let my memory lead me back to the pieces I had ignored. Not long ago, Lucas invited a few friends over for a backyard barbecue. I was trimming dead branches in the back, planning to finish and then rest in the small house. Lucas saw me and waved like he was calling over hired help. I thought he needed something, so I walked over. At the outdoor table, drinks were poured. Laughter filled the air. Lucas slung an arm around a younger man, introduced him casually, then suddenly raised his voice so everyone could hear. "This is my father-in-law. He lives back there. Old now, so we take care of him. Real sweetheart. He even thinks government assistance is a pension for model citizens." His friends burst out laughing. Some looked at me with pity, but they laughed along to blend in. I stood there, still holding the pruning shears. I looked at Lucas. He smirked, eyes cold. Rachel came out carrying a platter of meat just then, heard the comment, and instead of stopping it, she only smiled faintly, the tired smile of someone used to it. Lucas continued, even more mocking. "He lives off my wife's money, you know. Right, Dad?" The question was a slap, putting me on the spot. If I protested, I ruined the party. If I stayed silent, I accepted the label. I chose silence. I nodded once, as if it were normal. I stepped back, turned away, and heard the laughter rise again behind me. Back then, my chest tightened, but I told myself Lucas was just rude, that Rachel was stuck in the middle, that every family had moments like that. Now, sitting in the car, I remembered every word, every look, every laugh, and I realized what chilled me most. Lucas wasn't improvising. He spoke like someone prepared, like someone accustomed to turning me into a joke to lift himself up. And Rachel hadn't stayed silent once. She had stayed silent many times, as if silence were the price of staying comfortable. I took out the old phone and called the number again. The other end picked up quickly. Yes. I spoke slowly, clearly, like laying the first stones of a road. I wanted every document related to the house reviewed, every expense, everything under my name or ever signed by me. I wanted to know what, during those 5 years of pretending to be poor, had been transferred, misused, or exploited. The man's voice didn't waver. Understood. Where would you like to start? With the house, I said, and with anything that has my signature on it from the past 5 years. I heard papers flipping on the other end, as if a system had been ready to open at any time. Do you still have the originals? I do, I said, and only then did I realize I had done one thing right all these years. I had always kept a small safe in the back house. No one knew the code, not even Rachel. The call ended. I leaned back and stared at the car ceiling. Outside, light snow began to fall, thin as dust. I felt tired, but not the tiredness of old age. It was the fatigue of someone waking from a long sleep and realizing the room around him had been rummaged through. The next morning, I returned to the back house before dawn. The main house was still quiet. Maybe they slept well after a dinner without me. I locked the back door, turned on the small yellow kitchen light, and opened the safe. The documents were neatly stacked. I took out a bundle, sat at the table, and put on my reading glasses. When the first numbers appeared, I had to set the papers down and take a long breath. Not because I didn't understand, but because I understood too well. These weren't just a few borrowed amounts or paid on my behalf. The numbers had a path, dates, carefully worded notes, each small like a drop of water, together forming a steady stream. And that stream didn't flow toward me. I sat up straight and looked out the window. Outside, the main house stood still, beautiful, peaceful, like a painting. Inside that painting, they hadn't just disrespected me. They were exploiting me systematically. I couldn't sleep that night. The numbers kept flashing like red lights in fog. Each transfer looked reasonable alone, but together they formed a clearly drawn road leading straight away from me. Near midnight, I called the old number again, not to ask more questions, but to make a decision. The man's voice on the other end was as calm as earlier. I said just one sentence. Connect me with Evelyn Brooks. At this age, some names sound like keys turning. Evelyn was one of them. She had been my legal advisor when my company still ran like a freight train with no brakes. She wasn't a talkative lawyer. She listened, remembered, and asked the exact questions people couldn't dodge. I hadn't contacted her in years, telling myself I wanted peace. But peace doesn't mean closing your eyes. 15 minutes later, my phone rang. A woman's voice, low and concise. Derek. 2 syllables, and I felt pulled back into my place. Not an old man living behind the house, not the one who had soup thrown in his face. But Derek of dawn meetings, fountain pen contracts, decisions made in minutes that saved hundreds of people. I need you, I said. Tonight. Where are you? At home, the back house. A brief pause. I could almost see her nod on the other end. 1 hour. The cafe on Maple Glen Road. Back corner. Come alone. I put on a dark coat, a wool hat, and slowly drove the old car out of the driveway. The road was empty. Rain speckled the windshield. Streetlights stretched into long reflections on the wet pavement. The cafe was open late, not crowded, just a few long-haul drivers and a clerk wiping the counter, yawning. Evelyn was already seated at the back table, posture straight, silver hair neatly cut, a thin briefcase beside her. She looked me up and down, didn't ask about my health, didn't ask why I had vanished for so long. She only said, "Show me what you're seeing." I laid the stack of papers on the table. Statements, payments, bank letters I had ignored as routine notices. Evelyn put on her glasses and flipped through each page like an accountant turning a ledger. Every time she paused, I heard my own breathing. "Have you activated the emergency plan?" she asked, eyes still on the papers. I nodded. "I made the call." Evelyn's lips curved slightly, not a smile but a sign she understood I wasn't joking. "Good. You prepared that plan very carefully. I once thought you'd never use it." "So did I." She looked up, eyes sharp as a thin blade. "Then you have to accept one thing. Once you open this door, you can't go back to being the gentle old father you were." I stayed silent. I didn't want to be cruel. I just wanted the truth to stand where it belonged. Evelyn opened her briefcase, took out a small notebook and a pen. "We start with 3 things: debt, mortgages, shadow accounts. Have you taken any loans recently?" "I haven't." She nodded as if waiting for that answer. "But the documents show someone has borrowed using your assets." I felt a chill at the back of my neck. "How?" "Through power of attorney, forged signatures, or by using elder assistance status to legitimize it. I'm not concluding yet, but I see the signs." She turned to a page and tapped a line with her pen. "This one. A loan disbursed 8 months ago. The collateral is real estate in your name." I looked at it and thought my vision was blurred. The house I had paid for. I clearly remember the day I signed the papers, remember the smell of new wood in the living room. Now it was being used like a bargaining chip. Evelyn didn't let me sink into the shock. "We'll review everything, but you have to do one thing. Don't let them know you've woken up." "I understand," she continued, her voice low but firm. "When a thief knows they're being watched, they retreat. When they think they haven't been discovered, they expose more. You want evidence. Evidence only comes when they feel confident." I nodded. I could endure being insulted, but I couldn't endure being turned into a wallet they opened and closed whenever they wanted. We agreed on a plan. Evelyn would quietly contact the banks, obtain the original files, recheck the signatures, the notarization dates, the witnesses. I would keep playing the role of the confused old man, living quietly, so they wouldn't be alert. She warned me to lock the safe, keep the old phone, and make sure no documents were ever exposed in the main house. I got home close to 2 a.m. I slipped into the back house, turned on the desk lamp, put the papers into the safe, then sat down listening to the steady sound of rain on the porch. I thought I had arranged everything carefully enough, but the next morning, the incident happened at the exact moment I let my guard down. I was in the kitchen making tea, a few documents spread out on the table just to compare dates. I didn't think anyone would come in. Rachel rarely entered the back house unless she needed me to sign something or give her a bit of cash. And Lucas even less so, because he hated the damp smell of this small place, hated even my existence behind the yard. The door opening with a sharp click startled me. I turned around. Lucas stood there holding a bag, his eyes sweeping quickly around the room. That look wasn't curiosity, it was the look of someone inspecting. "What are you doing?" he asked, his tone just friendly enough not to sound rude, but sharp enough for me to know he was suspicious. For a second, my heart pounded. The papers were on the table. If Lucas read even a few lines, he'd know I was tracing the money trail. I didn't pull the papers back too quickly. Moving fast would give me away. I did the opposite. I slowly lifted the kettle, poured tea into the cup, my hand shaking on purpose, then looked at Lucas with tired eyes. "Huh? What did you say?" Lucas frowned. "What papers are you looking at?" I looked down at the pile as if I didn't know either. "Papers of… what was it again?" I gave a weak smile, the kind an absent-minded old man gives. I thought they were electricity bills. I was going to see why this month was so expensive. Lucas stepped closer. I still stood between him and the table, as if by accident. I sighed, putting on an annoyed-at-myself tone. "My eyes are bad now. My head, too. Numbers all blur together. Yesterday I even thought today was Monday." Rachel laughed at me. Lucas stared at me. I looked back, not evasive but not sharp either. I let my gaze drift slightly, like someone trying to remember. I let confusion cover my voice. "Did you need something?" Lucas lifted the bag. "Rachel told me to bring you some food, so you don't lack nutrients." He emphasized the last words, half pity, half mockery. I nodded, took the bag, thanked him. I bent down and deliberately dropped a spoon, then crouched to pick it up slowly. When I stood back up, Lucas glanced at the papers again, but didn't dare touch them. Maybe he didn't want to be seen rummaging through an old man's room. Before leaving, Lucas turned back, his voice light like a draft. "Don't sign anything carelessly. If you forget things, it could get messy." I nodded, smiling gently. "Yeah, I'll be careful." The door closed. I stood still for a long time, listening to his footsteps fade away. My back was cold with sweat. I gathered the papers, put them into the safe, locked it tightly. Then I sat down, looking out the window. Lucas was suspicious, just not certain yet. That evening, Evelyn called. Her voice was more serious. "I just received a set of files. There are at least 2 irregular loans. They're notarized. Someone signed on your behalf. And there's one more thing." "I'm listening," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Assets in your name are being used illegally, not just the house. There's also an investment account that's been withdrawn in portions. Someone is doing this very methodically." I closed my eyes. In my mind appeared Rachel's face, then Lucas's. I didn't want to believe my daughter could go that far. But the truth doesn't care what I want. Evelyn asked, "Do you want me to act right away?" I took a deep breath. "No, not yet." She paused for a few seconds, as if weighing it. "Are you sure?" "I want them to expose themselves," I replied. "If they think I don't know, they'll keep going. I need to see the whole picture, and I need them to say it themselves, with their own mouths or with their own signatures." Evelyn's voice softened slightly but remained firm. "All right, but you have to be extremely careful. They've started watching you." I looked into the darkness of the yard where the main house stood, lights warm, like a place of peace. I knew that inside that light someone was calculating. I said to Evelyn slowly, "I'll stay silent a little longer. Let them think I'm still an old man who's easy to fool." The call ended. I set the phone down, my fingers still faintly numb. I sat alone, listening to the ticking of the clock. They thought I was old, that my eyes were dim, that I had forgotten, but they didn't know that with just one more step, I would bring out something that left them no way back. And I had started preparing it the moment Lucas stood in my doorway, looking at my desk. 3 days later, Evelyn sent me a thin envelope. No return name. She told me not to open it in the main house and not to open it with anyone around. I took the envelope into the back house, closed the door, drew the curtains, then sat at the old wooden table by the window. Morning light filtered through the gap in the curtains, enough to read without turning on a lamp. Inside was a copy of a mortgage contract. I looked at the heading first, the house address, every number correct, every letter exact. No mistake. The house where I used to stand watering the lawn every afternoon. The house where Rachel grew up. The house I had paid for, dollar by dollar, owing the bank not a single cent. I turned the page. My name appeared under owner. Neat, clear. But when my eyes slid down to the signature line, my hand froze. That handwriting was not mine. It was similar, very similar. Enough to fool someone glancing quickly, but not enough to fool me. I knew my signature. I knew every slant, every pause of the pen, every unconscious habit when signing important documents. That signature was too even, too clean. It was copied, not written. I swallowed. My chest tightened, but not from panic. It was the feeling of something long suspected finally standing bare, leaving no room to lie to myself. I turned to the next page. Witness section. Rachel's name. I stared at that name for a long time. So long that I could clearly hear the wall clock ticking in the small room. No other sound. No cars, no voices. Just me, and my daughter's name sitting beneath a signature that wasn't mine. I didn't stand up. I didn't slam the table. I didn't call to ask. There are moments when calling only ruins everything. I learned that long before I became a father. When the truth is still arranging itself, rushed questions only make it hide. I folded the papers carefully, put them back into the envelope, then placed the envelope into the safe. I locked it, turning the combination slowly, as if each number were a breath. When I stood up, my legs felt heavy, but my mind was clearer than ever. That afternoon, I received another call from Evelyn. The loan was disbursed 8 months ago, she said, straight to the point. The amount isn't small. High interest, harsh terms, not a traditional bank. I leaned back in my chair. Who's listed as the borrower? Lucas, Evelyn answered. Your house was used as collateral, and your signature was used to legitimize it. I nodded slightly, even though she couldn't see me. All the pieces were finding their places. I asked, my voice still even, where is that loan now? It's been partially sold to a third party, but the original institution still holds primary control. Evelyn paused. And this is the important part. The loan is delinquent. I closed my eyes, not out of fear, but because I could see the road ahead clearly. Lucas had borrowed money based on the assumption that I would never find out. Or if I did, I'd panic, ask him to handle it, sign more papers to save the situation. He had built an entire plan on the image of a weak old man. Is there a way to buy that debt? I asked. Evelyn was silent for a few seconds. I knew she was considering it. Yes, but it's not easy. And if you do, you'll become the creditor, no longer the passive party. I want to do it, I said without hesitation. Do you understand what that means? Her voice dropped. You'll hold enormous legal leverage over the borrower, and if it leaks too early, they'll react. I'll keep it secret, I replied. Absolutely. Evelyn exhaled softly. I'll need time, and I'll need you to sign some authorization papers. This time, your real signature. You'll have it. The call ended. I stood up and stepped out onto the back porch. The sky was overcast. Gray clouds hung low and heavy. I looked toward the main house. The living room window was slightly open, so I saw Rachel's silhouette pass by, phone in hand. She looked like she always did. Normal. Everyday life kept flowing, even when beneath it lay a mine already planted. That evening, Lucas came by. He knocked on the back house door without waiting to be invited. He leaned against the doorframe, eyes scanning out of habit. How are you feeling lately? He asked, pretending concern. About the same, I replied. Old age. Lucas smiled. Rachel worries about you. She says you should rest more. Don't bother with paperwork. I looked at him. Really looked. That face showed no cracks, but I knew these words weren't accidental. He was probing. Yeah, I said. I'm old. Paperwork gives me headaches. Lucas nodded as if he'd gotten the answer he wanted. That's good. Just let us handle things. I smiled, the smile of an easy old man. I let him believe it. He didn't know that in that very moment I had already decided. 2 weeks later, Evelyn called again. It's done. Tell me. We've acquired the entire debt through an intermediary entity. Your name appears nowhere, she said slowly. Legally, the new creditor has the right to demand payment, restructure, or enforce other terms. I sat still, didn't move. In my mind, a large door had just closed behind me. Ahead was a path with no turning back. From now on, Evelyn continued, you're not just the homeowner. You're the one holding the rope Lucas is standing on. I looked out the window. The sky was still gray, but the light felt different, less heavy than before. Keep it secret, I reminded her. No one can know. Of course, she replied. How do you want to proceed? Slowly, I said. I want them to keep thinking I know nothing. I want them confident. And when they're most confident, I'll make my move. Evelyn didn't add anything. She understood. She always did when my mind was set. I hung up and placed the phone on the table. There were no documents on it anymore, only a cup of tea gone cold. I lifted it and took a small sip. The bitterness spread slowly on my tongue. I had become my son-in-law's creditor. No one knew, not a trace. And that was only the first step in a move that, once revealed, would leave no way back for anyone in that house. I let 2 more days pass as if nothing had happened, then chose a drizzly afternoon to return to the main house. I didn't walk straight in like a man with pride left. I moved slowly, one hand on the wooden fence as if I needed support, shoulders slightly hunched, my breathing deliberately heavier than usual. I wanted them to see exactly what they expected. An old man cornered, tired, easy to guide with a few sweet words. The door opened. Rachel stood there, hair hastily tied back, eyes slightly red as if she'd been crying or trying to look like she had. She hugged me, quick and tight, but cold. I smelled the familiar soap of this house, something that once made me feel safe, now reminding me of the hot soup thrown in my face. "You're back, Dad?" Rachel said softly. I'm sorry about that night." Lucas appeared behind her, holding a glass of water, lips curved in a polite smile. "Come in. That night, I lost my temper. We were all stressed." I nodded, pretending that apology was a bridge to salvation. I stepped into the living room, looked around as if I hadn't been here in a long time. Everything was still neat, furniture in its place. Only one thing had changed: the atmosphere. It wasn't warm anymore. It felt like a place where plans had already been made for me. Rachel guided me to the armchair, the one my wife used to like. Lucas handed me the glass, his hand briefly touching my shoulder like a caring gesture. I took a small sip, then set it down, letting my hand tremble slightly. Not too much, just enough for them to believe. "Have you been eating properly?" Rachel asked. "I worry you're alone." "I'm fine," I said hoarsely. "Just tired." Lucas immediately grabbed onto the word tired like a key. "Maybe you should think about a place with care, somewhere with nurses, people to remind you to take your meds. It's dangerous out there." Rachel nodded, eyes on me, trying to look concerned. "I think so too. Don't misunderstand, Dad. I'm doing this for you." I lowered my head and sighed like a man being taken care of. Inside, another layer of cold settled in. They apologized. They cared. But it all led to the same place. Get me out of here. Put me somewhere cheap, out of sight, easy to control. And if I disappeared from this house, everything else would slide into their hands much faster. I stayed for dinner. Lucas cooked a stew, the smell just rich enough to trick memory. Rachel poured tea, asked a few scattered questions, talked about the neighbors, the utility bills, and my old car out by the back house that had been sitting too long and was wearing down. Everything sounded like family. But beneath that soft fabric, I could feel the stiff seams pulling tight. After dinner, Rachel told me to rest in the living room while she went down to the kitchen to wash dishes. Lucas stepped into the hallway with his phone, speaking in a low voice as he walked, clearly thinking I couldn't hear. I stayed still, my back against the chair, eyes on the wall clock, ears following every footstep. I've lived long enough to know that houses carry sound. If you stay quiet long enough, you hear where everyone is. About half an hour later, I pretended to yawn and pushed myself up. "I'm a little dizzy. I'll go back to the back house to rest," I said. Rachel stood up quickly. "Don't go. Stay here. I'll make up the bed for you." "No need," I replied. "I'm used to it." Lucas glanced at Rachel, a quick look like a signal. "Suit yourself," he said. "But come up tomorrow. We need to seriously talk about your care." I nodded and walked toward the door. Before leaving, I deliberately left my hat on the chair. I knew I'd be back in a few minutes, and I knew they would talk, just as expected. I stepped into the yard, took a few steps, then stopped under the porch roof, pretending to fumble for my keys. When the door closed behind me, Lucas's voice immediately changed. It was no longer polite, no longer "sir." It became sharp and low. "You see," Lucas said, "he really is weak now. We need to move fast." Rachel answered, her voice smaller but not objecting. "Don't talk like that. He's still—" "My dad." "My dad?" Lucas scoffed. "Your dad is a breathing safe. You want him hanging around here messing up the plan?" I pulled the old phone from my coat pocket. The screen was slightly cracked at the corner, but the recorder still worked perfectly. I'd turned it on the moment I stepped outside. My finger brushed the button lightly, like flipping a switch in my head. I wasn't listening with my heart anymore. I was listening with clarity. Rachel sighed. "What are you planning to do?" "Put him in a nursing home," Lucas said briskly. "A cheap one, far away. Once he signs the papers, we have control. If he doesn't sign, we handle it another way. Tell the doctor he's confused. There are records, evaluations. You understand, right?" "You talk as if—" Rachel hesitated. "As if what?" Lucas snapped. "As if he's a person. Let me tell you this. If he keeps hanging around, I can't sell the car. I can't pull money from the old account. I can't clean up the paperwork. You want to live in this house forever with an old man sitting there watching us?" Rachel was silent for a few seconds. When she spoke, her voice was thin as paper. "You said you wouldn't let me worry about money anymore." "That's exactly what I'm doing," Lucas replied. "He just needs to disappear from the picture. You do your part. Gentle, tears, apologies. You're good at that." I clenched my teeth but kept my breathing steady. Light rain dotted my wrist, cold enough to sharpen my senses. I watched the phone screen, the sound levels jumping with every sentence. Each jump was evidence, a rope they were tying themselves. Lucas continued as casually as if he were talking about buying a chair. "Tomorrow I'll take him to see the place. If he reacts, you say it's for his health. If he asks about the house, you say the paperwork's in your name for convenience. Don't argue too much. He's weak now. Just give him a little push." Rachel made a small, choking sound. I waited for resistance, but all I heard was the scrape of a chair, the clink of a glass on the table, and then a word so small I would have missed it if I hadn't been standing right there. "Okay, I'll try." I closed my eyes for a second. In my mind, there was no longer the image of little Rachel running home to show me an A grade. There was only the name Rachel under the witness section and the voice that had just said, "Okay." I stopped the recording and slipped the phone back into my pocket, like putting away a knife that had already been sharpened. Then I knocked on the door gently, like someone who'd just remembered something trivial. Rachel opened the door immediately, her face already rearranged, eyes shining as if she'd been crying out of concern for her father. "Did you forget something?" I held up my hat. I forgot this. Be careful going back to the back house, she said softly. Lucas stood behind her, arms crossed, the polite smile back in place. See you tomorrow. Get some rest. I put on my hat and nodded. Yeah, tomorrow. I turned and walked down the steps. The rain kept falling. The porch light cast a pale yellow glow, stretching my shadow long across the path. I didn't look back. If I did, I might feel the pain. I needed the cold. I needed the clarity. Back in the back house, I locked the door, sat at the table, took out the phone, and replayed a short section to make sure the audio was clear. Then I set it down and stared at it for a long time. They didn't just want money. They wanted me gone. And when someone wants you gone, they don't stop at words. I stood up slowly, took Evelyn's envelope from the safe, and placed it beside the old phone. The two lay next to each other like two sides of the same truth. I kept playing the victim because they believed I was about to collapse. But even then, in my mind, I had already chosen the timing. Just a little longer. Let them grow more confident. Let them take one more step into the trap they didn't even know they were digging. The next morning, Rachel sent me a short, carefully worded message. We're having a small gathering tonight. Come eat with us. A few of Lucas's friends are stopping by. The word small made me chuckle under my breath because I'd seen the schedule Lucas had left on the kitchen table the night before. A printed page with an event planning company logo, a guest list, and the words, signing celebration. They weren't planning to take me to see a nursing home just yet. They were planning a party to turn signing papers into something festive, with witnesses, wine, and laughter. When things are dressed up, people sign more easily. When they sign in front of a crowd, it's harder to take it back. I showered, shaved, and put on my old light blue shirt. The one Rachel once said made me look gentler. I deliberately chose the shoes with worn heels to keep the image they wanted. A weak, outdated old man. Nothing to fear. In my coat pocket, the old phone rested quietly, like a small but heavy stone. In the inner pocket, I slipped a small note with a few words Evelyn had sent the night before. Don't sign anything. Let them present the papers. Stay calm. I arrived at the main house just as the sky darkened. The garden lights were on like a small hotel. The front door stood wide open. Inside, soft jazz played over lively chatter. The smell of grilled meat, perfume, and wine blended together. Lucas hadn't organized a family dinner. He'd built a stage. Guests filled the living room and spilled into the dining area. A man in a suit shook Lucas's hand like they'd just closed a deal. A group of women laughed loudly by the bar, red wine catching the light. I spotted a middle-aged man with glasses scanning the room, the look of a lawyer or a notary. Evelyn had told me that if they wanted the papers to matter, they'd bring someone official, or at least someone professional as a witness. Lucas spotted me and immediately switched to host mode, loud and bright. He's here. Everyone, this is my father-in-law, Derek. He took my elbow, not to support me, but to hold me. Eyes passed over me like they were appraising an antique. Some nodded politely, some smirked. A younger man leaned toward someone beside him, whispered something, and they both looked at me like I was a joke. Rachel came over, wearing a dark dress, more makeup than usual. She hugged me and kissed my cheek, soft but quick. Sit here, Dad. She guided me to a chair in the corner near the window where the light didn't hit directly. A seat that let me be present without bothering anyone. I sat down, hands on my knees. I let my shoulders sag, my gaze drift, as if trying to remember where I was. I watched people move around, listened to them talk about stocks, new projects, an investor flying in from Chicago. A few company names reached my ears and told me Lucas had spun a story big enough to impress the crowd. This party wasn't just to make me sign. It was to show that he was about to level up. In the middle of the living room, a table had been set, covered with a white cloth. On it lay a thick folder, a signing pen, and a standing microphone like one used for speeches. I noticed it immediately because Lucas wanted everyone to see it. He wanted the moment witnessed, maybe even recorded. Lucas circulated, introducing guests, laughing, clinking glasses, building the mood. From time to time, he glanced back at me, checking whether the fish was still lying quietly on the board. Rachel also looked my way now and then, her eyes torn between worry and forced calm. I sat there for nearly an hour. I didn't eat much, just sipped water. I tilted my head slightly, like I was tired. A few guests came over, shook my hand, said polite things like, "Nice to meet you." I answered slowly, my eyes a beat behind, like it took effort to process the questions. I saw them relax. The more relaxed they became, the more honest they spoke. A man with salt and pepper hair laughed with Lucas. "So everything gets signed tonight, huh? Good thing. Family matters are better handled cleanly." Lucas laughed loudly. "Yes, just arrangements for him. He forgets things." He said it the way one talks about a faulty appliance. Then Lucas clapped his hands to get attention. The music lowered. Everyone's eyes moved to the table with the white cloth. Lucas stepped forward, his voice like an MC's. "Thank you all for coming. I know everyone's busy. Tonight is a special occasion. Our family wants to make sure everything is arranged properly, and I want to thank my father-in-law for trusting us." He turned to me, extending his hand like inviting a supporting actor onto the stage. Rachel came over, gently taking my hand. "Come up here for a moment, Dad." I stood slowly. I let my legs shake just enough to lean on her. I took each step toward the table. The room fell silent with every step, not out of respect but curiosity. Silent the way people get when they're waiting to see someone fall to confirm a rumor. Lucas placed his hand on my shoulder and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You just need to sign here. This is a power of attorney, so Rachel and I can help manage your finances. You won't have to worry. Less stress." I looked down at the stack of papers. Small print, many pages. I didn't read them. I already knew what they wanted. I only looked at the signature line and the witness section. My heart chilled for a beat, even though I was prepared, because Rachel's name there felt like a stain that wouldn't wash out. The man with glasses stood beside us, stamp in hand, the neutral expression of someone used to paperwork. A few guests raised their phones, afraid to miss the moment. Lucas placed the pen in my hand. This was where they thought I would break. I let my hand shake, not with fear, but exactly the way they expected. My fingers curled, the pen wobbling as if about to fall. I heard a collective intake of breath, then a few suppressed chuckles. I saw Lucas press his lips together, like he'd already won. "Dad, you can do it," Rachel said, her voice trembling, playing the role of the pitiful daughter caring for her old father. I lowered my head, brought the pen close to the paper, then lifted it again like I couldn't remember what to do. I frowned, looked around as if searching for someone to ask. The entire room held its breath, just as Lucas wanted. I could hear ice clink in someone's glass. I could hear the wall clock ticking. At that exact moment, in the middle of the silence, I felt something shift, like still water with a current changing underneath. I looked up. My eyes were no longer unfocused. I looked straight at Lucas. Not long, not dramatic, just enough to make him freeze for a fraction of a second. Then I looked at Rachel. She stood there, hands clasped, lips tight, eyes wavering. The pen was still in my hand, but I didn't lower it. Instead, I set it gently on the table, like placing a feather, then reached toward the microphone standing beside the folder. Lucas leaned slightly, thinking I was about to say a few thank you words for appearances. He even let a self-satisfied smile form, as if already hearing the applause. I picked up the microphone. The entire room froze, and in the moment before they could understand what the confused old man was about to do, I took a deep breath, looked around at the faces waiting for me to sign, and spoke. I raised the microphone close to my mouth, my voice not loud but clear enough to cut through the silence. I apologize for interrupting your party. I paused, my eyes sweeping over the half-raised glasses. But before I sign anything, I think you should know what you're actually witnessing. Lucas gave a tight smile and edged closer, his hand lifting slightly as if to grab the microphone. I shifted my body just enough to avoid him, keeping my polite smile. Just 1 minute, Lucas. 1 minute, so everything is clear. I gestured toward the large television mounted on the wall, the one they use to watch football every Sunday. Before coming here, I'd known they would put on a show, so I prepared mine as well. The old phone in my coat pocket felt warm, like it had a pulse. I pressed once, lightly. The TV screen flickered on. A video icon appeared. Several people turned their heads instinctively. Lucas stood rigid, like he'd just heard a pin drop in empty space. The video played. The image showed their dining room, warm yellow light, the sound of spoons against bowls. Then Lucas's voice rang out, unmistakable. Dump it. Dump it right in his face. This old man doesn't deserve a decent meal. There was a soft laugh in the video, sharp and deliberate. Then the hot soup splashed. The man on the screen was me, older, head bowed, frozen for a second like I'd been nailed to the chair. And then came Rachel's voice, my daughter's voice, the same voice that once woke me early to go fishing. He's right, Dad. You should know your place. A sharp "oh" escaped somewhere in the living room. Someone covered her mouth. A woman near the bar winced like she'd just heard something that didn't belong at a polite party. Lucas lunged toward the TV, but the remote was useless, and the TV was already set to the input I controlled. He stabbed at the buttons wildly, then spun around to glare at me, his face flushed red, his eyes ready to tear apart the fake politeness. Rachel stood by the table, her face drained of color, fingers digging into the edge of the white cloth. The video ended with footage of me standing up, wiping my face, and walking out. And exactly as I intended, there was no explanation, no justification, just the raw truth, bare as a slap. I didn't say anything yet. I let the silence do its work. For a few seconds, no one knew where to look. Looking at Lucas felt uncomfortable. Looking at Rachel felt awkward. Looking at me felt confusing. I pressed the button again. This time it wasn't video, but audio. From the TV speakers came the recording I'd taken in this very house, on the night I pretended to go to bed early. Lucas's voice was low but cold. Next week we put him in that nursing home out west, the cheap kind. Once he signs, it's done. Nobody's got time to take care of him. Rachel's voice cut in, hoarse, like she was forcing herself to believe this was right. But if Dad asks, Lucas cut her off. Asks what? He won't remember anyway. Just say the doctor recommended it. Then sell the car, pull all that money, cut contact for a few weeks. He'll get used to it. In the living room, a man in a dark suit, the look of an investor, set his glass down with a sharp clink. He looked at Lucas, his eyes turning cold. You said this was family arrangements, he said, his voice calm but biting. So this is what you meant. Another man, younger, glanced at the lawyer with glasses and shook his head. They didn't need to talk. One look was enough. I heard chairs scrape. A group of guests began backing toward the door, not loudly but decisively, like people who had chosen not to remain in the same room as something filthy. Someone murmured, "Excuse me." Someone else didn't say a word. Lucas panicked. He raised both hands, forcing a smile. You're misunderstanding. That was just a moment of bad judgment. And that recording, who knows if it was edited? The lawyer with glasses still stood by the table, his face now gray. He looked at the papers, then at Lucas, his eyes plainly saying he wanted no part of this anymore. He capped the pen and slipped it into his pocket, the movement clean and final, like cutting a rope before falling with it. Rachel stepped forward, her voice shaking. "Dad, stop." She reached out as if to touch my hand, then pulled back, too many eyes watching. I looked at my daughter and saw the fear clearly in her eyes. Fear of losing her husband, fear of losing her image, fear of losing what she thought was safety. But among all of it, what hurt me most was that she wasn't afraid of losing me. She was afraid of losing the life I had laid the foundation for. I spoke into the microphone calmly. "I didn't come here to ask for anyone's pity, and I didn't come here to complain." I pointed to the stack of papers. "I came to say that I will not sign. And I also came to tell you that the man standing next to me invited you to this party based on a lie." Lucas roared, losing control. "Who do you think you are, acting superior? You're just an old man." I smirked. "I'm Derek." I said it slowly, letting the name drop like a heavy coin. 72 years old, and I'm the man who bought this house with my own money. I looked straight at Lucas. "I'm also the one whose name is on the mortgage you've been using." The room went dead silent in the truest sense. Someone sucked in a breath. Someone whispered very softly, "No way." I didn't need to brag. I just needed the truth to stand where it belonged. "I once founded a logistics company. I sold it many years ago," I said, like recounting an old story with no pride or regret. I stepped out of the spotlight because I wanted peace, and because I wanted to see how my family would treat me when there was no easy money in my hands. Lucas scoffed, but the sound cracked. "You're making it up." I nodded slightly. "Evelyn Brooks doesn't think so." I dropped the name and saw Lucas flinch exactly one beat. "And neither does the bank," Lucas charged. Not the kind of charge you see in movies. It was the frantic lunge of a man being stripped bare in front of a crowd. He reached for the microphone, his hand grabbing my shoulder. The smell of alcohol and sweat rose up. Rachel let out a short cry. I didn't step back. I turned halfway, lowered the microphone, and made the only counter move I needed. I pressed the red button on the phone in my coat pocket. The button Evelyn had told me to use only if I needed to end things quickly. It wasn't magic. It was a signal tied to the file she'd already set in motion. Immediately, the doorbell rang, a hard, confirming sound. Then, from outside, 2 men in security uniforms stepped in, not running, not loud, but their eyes alone were enough to make Lucas freeze. One stood between Lucas and me, his voice polite but firm. "Sir, please keep your distance." Lucas stood rooted to the spot. The whole room stared at him like a man caught in the act. Investors who hadn't yet reached the door stopped and turned back to watch. No one spoke, but judgment sat in every gaze. I picked up the microphone one last time. My voice was steady. "Tonight's party ends here." I looked straight at Lucas, then at Rachel. As for family matters, there will be a day I address them privately, but not as part of a performance. I set the microphone down on the table, right beside the pen, and when I walked out of that house, cold wind hit my face, and behind me I heard a low swell of noise like waves. I didn't turn around, because I knew they had lost the most important thing tonight. Not money, but control of the story. I had just stepped down the front steps when I heard screeching brakes behind me, car doors slamming one after another, sharp and rapid like rain on a metal roof. Blue and red lights spilled across the lawn, washing over the rose bushes Rachel once tended, turning them into cold streaks of color. I didn't turn back right away. I paused for a moment, letting the night air slip into my collar, letting my heart slow after the minutes inside. Then I heard fast footsteps on the stone path and a clear, authoritative male voice at the front door. "Police. Everyone stay where you are." Inside the house came a sound I knew well, the sound of a crowded room suddenly losing power in the mind. Not lights going out, but confidence. Laughter vanished, voices dropped, someone cleared their throat. Someone hurriedly said, "What's going on?" as if asking could reset everything. I turned back slowly. The front door stood wide open. 2 police officers entered first, followed by people in dark jackets, the look of professionals at work, not party guests. One had a badge clipped to his chest, glinting under the lights. I didn't need to read it. I recognized the cold presence of discipline and paperwork, the kind that can't be bought with a few promises. Lucas stood near the table, his face still flushed with anger and shame. When he saw them, his eyes widened. Then he immediately looked for an escape, like an animal cornered. But tonight, this house was no longer his stage. "He called them," Lucas shouted, pointing at me as if the crowd still belonged to him. "That old man, he made it up." One officer raised a hand. "Sir, please remain calm." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. "We're here with a warrant connected to an ongoing investigation." I saw Rachel standing close to a chair, arms wrapped around herself like she was holding something invisible. Her lips trembled. Her eyes darted to Lucas, then to me, then down to the floor. She looked like someone who had woken in the middle of a nightmare and realized she was the one who had opened the door and let it in. One of the men in dark jackets stepped forward and opened a folder. Lucas Harper. He read Lucas's full name the way it's read on a report, not spoken familiarly. "You are under investigation and being detained for financial fraud, use of forged documents, and false tax declarations. There are also offenses related to the unauthorized use of mortgaged assets." Those words fell into the room like stones. Someone near the door gasped, "Oh my God!" Someone else stepped back, instinctively tugging at their coat, as if afraid of being stained just by sharing the air. Lucas let out a hollow laugh. "Nonsense. I have a lawyer. You can't—" The lawyer with glasses, the one who had quietly put away his pen earlier, stood nearby, eyes turned away. He didn't step forward. He didn't deny anything. He simply stayed silent, like someone who had pulled his hand off the table just in time before it collapsed. An officer stepped closer and instructed Lucas to turn around. Lucas reflexively brushed him off, struggling, trying to keep some shred of dignity in front of the faces that had been raising glasses to him minutes earlier. But the more he struggled, the more desperate he looked. When his hands were pulled behind his back, metal met skin with a dry, unmistakable click that I heard as clearly as a door locking shut. Handcuffs, that's what they call them, out of habit. But tonight, to me, they were a period at the end of a sentence. Guests began to leave in a rush, not running from fear but from shame. They slipped past one another, avoided each other's eyes, their voices turning into hurried excuses. "I have to go." "Sorry, I didn't know." What on earth just happened? High heels clicked quickly across the floor. Glasses of wine were left, abandoned on tables. A napkin fell to the floor, untouched. A man who had shaken Lucas's hand earlier now stood at the exit, looking at me as if he wanted to ask something. I gave a very slight nod. Not a greeting, but a signal that he should leave. He understood immediately and turned away, unwilling to be further involved. Amid the chaos, a bank representative with the dark-jacketed group spoke quietly to the police. I caught fragments like asset freeze and mortgaged property. Then someone stepped outside and placed a seizure notice on the gate. The house was sealed, and from that point on, every step would go through legal process. The house they had bragged about as Lucas and Rachel's now stood like evidence. Rachel finally broke. She took a step forward, then her legs gave out as if all strength had been drained. She didn't scream. She gasped for air, clutching her chest, eyes wide with panic. "No, this can't be," she repeated, like a child lost in a supermarket. "Lucas, you told me—" Lucas turned back. his face ghost white, hands cuffed behind him. In that moment, there was no confidence left, no mocking smile. Just a man exposed. He looked at Rachel, then at me, and the hatred in his eyes burned so hot I felt it on my skin. "You did this," Lucas hissed, his voice rough with fear. "You want to ruin me." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The truth doesn't need to shout. A financial investigator stepped forward, his tone as calm as reading an appointment schedule. "Mr. Derek, we have confirmed the loan acquisition records." He looked at me. "You are the legal creditor on this property's mortgage." The statement was spoken out loud in a room that had treated me like a confused old man. It wasn't a declaration for my satisfaction. It was the final confirmation that I wasn't lying. I had held the right thread, and now that thread had pulled the curtain down. Lucas doubled over as if punched in the stomach. "No, impossible! He's broke! I stepped a little closer, close enough for him to hear without a microphone. I spoke quietly, evenly. "You made one very basic mistake." I looked straight into his eyes. "I'm not weak. I was just silent." Rachel lifted her head to look at me, tears finally falling, too late. "Dad?" she whispered. "Dad, I stood still. I didn't step back, and I didn't step forward. Inside me was a strange emptiness, not joy. It felt like when a storm finally passes, leaving wreckage behind that someone has to clear away, piece by piece. The police led Lucas toward the door. As he crossed the threshold, he tried to turn back one last time, as if to memorize the house, as if to cling to what he'd lost. But the cuffs pulled him forward, denying him even that choice. Outside, the wind had picked up. Patrol lights still flashed. A neighbor cracked open a door to look, then shut it again. Rachel remained collapsed on the floor. A woman from the earlier crowd hesitated, then left the house like the others. No one stayed to comfort her. They came for a party. They left to avoid contamination. Lucas's world didn't collapse because of shouting, but because no one stood beside him anymore. I looked at Rachel, at the daughter I had once held while she burned with fever, once stayed up all night listening to her breathe. I said nothing. I simply exhaled, long and slow. I didn't celebrate. Because when justice arrives, it doesn't bring fireworks. It brings silence and a door closing, leaving the people inside to listen to themselves. Rachel was still kneeling on the floor when the last vehicle pulled out of the driveway. The blue and red lights faded, leaving the living room's yellow glow suddenly too bright, too exposed. No voices, no clinking glasses, just the smell of cold food and a chair tipped on its side like the mark of a life knocked off balance. I walked slowly back inside. The wooden floor creaked softly under my shoes, the sound making Rachel flinch. She looked up, her face streaked with tears, eyes red and lost, as if she couldn't believe any of this had really happened. "Dad," her voice broke. "Please, don't do this. I really didn't know it would turn out like this." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't comfort her right away either. I looked around the house at the long table, the half-eaten dishes, the crumpled napkins, and I saw a cold truth clearly. This was the place where they planned to turn me into a signature. Now it had become the ruins of greed. I pulled a chair upright and sat down. I didn't choose the head of the table. I chose the chair across from Rachel, so her eyes had to meet mine with nowhere else to hide. "Stand up," I said softly. "Sit on the chair. Don't kneel." Rachel shook her head, tears dripping onto her wrist. "I don't deserve to—" "Stand up," I repeated, my voice still even. Not the command of a man trying to win, but the voice of a father who wanted a conversation between two human beings. She staggered to her feet and sat down like someone whose bones had been drained away. Her hands clenched together, her knees trembling. She looked at me as if waiting for a sentence. I opened my coat and took out a thin envelope. It had been in my jacket since the night of the soup. I placed it on the table, not throwing it, not slamming it down. just setting it there, like placing a mirror. Rachel, I said her name, the way I hadn't in a long time without avoidance. You said you didn't know. She nodded hard, clinging to that sentence. I was scared, Dad. Lucas. He said if I didn't do what he told me to. I raised my hand to stop her. You'll tell me everything. But first, look at this. I opened the envelope and pulled out several documents. The pages were clearly printed, signatures sitting in the corners. I turned them one by one, neither fast nor slow, like someone who had decided not to let emotion drag the story off course. When Rachel saw the signature, her face went white. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. This is the mortgage file, I said, and this is the witness section. I placed my finger on the exact spot. Rachel's name sat there beside a line of text. It was no longer a story. It was ink. Rachel shook her head over and over. Dad, I only signed because Lucas said it was paperwork to update the utility contract. I didn't read carefully. I was afraid he'd get angry. I was afraid he'd leave me. I was afraid. I looked at her for a long time. For a moment, I saw again the little girl sitting in a hospital hallway, hugging her knees, afraid the doctor would call her mother's name. But I also saw the grown woman who had let fear become an excuse. I slid another document toward her. And this. Rachel looked down, then broke into sobs. It was a power of attorney, cleverly drafted, authorizing Lucas to represent her in certain transactions. The explanation was long and tangled, but the signature was clear. You want me to believe you didn't understand, I said slowly, each word heavy like a small stone dropping into deep water. But you put your pen down more than once. Rachel covered her mouth, sobbing. I was forced. You don't understand. He changed. When we first got married, he wasn't like this. I understand change, I replied, and I understand fear, but listen to me carefully. I leaned forward slightly, not threatening, just close enough that Rachel couldn't escape by distance. In life, there are moments when people are pushed into a corner, but there is always a choice. I tapped my fingertip lightly on the table. You could have called me. You could have said one sentence, just one. You could have refused to be a witness. You could have refused to let them call me an old man who deserved to have soup dumped on him. Rachel lowered her head. I thought you couldn't handle the pressure. I thought if I spoke up, everything would collapse. I thought I could keep things calm. You chose calm, I said, but calm for whom? That question made Rachel look up. Her eyes widened, staring at me like she'd been slapped. Not because I was cruel, but because the question hit the truth she had been avoiding. I exhaled and continued more gently. I'm not a perfect father. I stayed silent for many years. I pretended to be poor, pretended to be weak to test people's hearts. I thought if you still had a bit of love, you would see me, not my wallet. I was wrong to put you in a test you never knew you were taking. Rachel shuddered as if hearing a confession more painful than punishment. So, you trapped me too? I shook my head. No, you walked in on your own. I just stopped being the cushion. Rachel lunged forward, her hands sliding over the papers. Dad, please, I'll do anything to fix this. I'll divorce him. I'll work 2 jobs. I'll pay it back. Please don't abandon me. There was truth in that plea. I heard it, and that was what made my chest ache. If it had all been fake, this would have been easier. I extended my hand, not touching her, just resting it on the edge of the table like closing a door somewhere inside me. I won't sue you, I said. Rachel froze, like someone who had just been loosened from a noose, but I wasn't finished. I won't sue you, I repeated, because I don't want your entire life tied to a lawsuit with your father's name on it. I don't want your children one day reading court records and seeing their grandfather dragging his daughter into court." Rachel began to cry harder, from gratitude, from shame, from knowing she had just been spared a piece of dignity she had nearly lost herself. I looked at her and said the rest, the part she needed to hear in order to grow up. "But from today on, I'm cutting off all support," I said, my voice not loud but hard as old wood. "No more money, no more Dad will take care of it. No more life rafts for you to float on and call that living." Rachel went rigid. "Dad, I can't survive." I tilted my head and looked straight at her. "You will survive. You just haven't had to live by your own choices before." She shook her head, desperate. "You're punishing me." "No," I replied. "I'm putting you on the ground. You're used to standing on other people's shoulders, so you think the ground is punishment?" Rachel fell silent. Tears kept falling, but her eyes began to change. No longer just panic. Something like the first realization that apologies can't erase ink. I stood up and straightened my coat. Before leaving, I placed a business card on the table beside the documents. "This is Evelyn Brooks's number," I said. "Not for you to beg me, for you to ask for a plan for yourself. If you truly want out of Lucas's life, you need to do it the right way. And if you want to make amends, you start by telling the truth to yourself." Rachel looked at the card like she was staring at a new road opening through the wreckage. I walked to the door and paused for a beat. I didn't turn around right away, but my voice softened just a little. "Rachel," I said, "love doesn't mean salvation. I'm still your father. But I won't save you from the consequences you chose." When I opened the door, night air rushed in, carrying the cold scent of winter and the sound of dry leaves scraping along the ground. Behind me, Rachel let out a small, trembling sentence, like a final confession. "I signed because I was afraid of him, and because I thought you would always be there." I closed the door very gently. Outside, the sky was pitch black. I stood on the steps, looking at the seizure notice on the gate, looking at the silent house like a warning. There was pain in me, but also clarity. I hadn't lost my daughter tonight, but I had forced her to face herself, stripped bare, with nowhere left to hide. I didn't drive back to the guest house. That night, I went straight to Evelyn's office, even though it was late. The hallway lights were still on, the cold kind of light where people work with the truth. Evelyn didn't ask much. She just looked at me and nodded like someone who had predicted this step long ago. "You're sure?" she asked. I answered with one sentence. "I want it clean." The next morning, I stood in front of the house where I once thought there would be family laughter. The police were gone, the tapes still there. With written authorization already in place, I was allowed inside with a legal representative and a property management agent. No one spoke loudly. We walked through each room like moving through a memory that had rotted. I didn't smash anything. I didn't throw things. I did the simplest thing they had never understood. I cleaned up. Wedding photos, flashy decorations Lucas loved to show off, engraved glasses. I packed them into boxes, sealed them, labeled them clearly to return to the right people at the right addresses. The things that belonged to me, I chose coldly. Documents, a few old books, my wife's watch, a worn wool blanket. The rest I didn't need. By noon, the house was completely empty. So empty that footsteps echoed clearly. I stood in the living room where hot soup had once steamed on my face and quietly took down the curtains. Light flooded in, no longer blocked by heavy fabric and secrets. Evelyn handed me a donation file, a local organization that supports people experiencing homelessness and families in temporary need. They run programs that turn seized or donated houses into safe shelters with management, counseling support, and hot meals. I read every line and signed every page, my hand steady. When the pen touched the paper, I felt a kind of revenge Lucas could never buy with money, turning what they tried to take into something they would never touch again. Not because I wanted anyone to suffer, but because I wanted value to return to where it belonged. In the late afternoon, representatives from the organization arrived. They didn't cheer. They didn't make a show. They just shook my hand, their eyes serious and warm. One of them said quietly, "You've saved a lot of cold nights." I didn't respond with anything grand. I just nodded. Before leaving, I stood in the doorway and looked back one last time. I didn't try to keep a single toxic memory. I didn't carry the smell of soup, the quiet laughter, or the words, "You should know your place." I left it all behind in a house that had changed owners in a way no one expected. I walked down the steps. The wind crossed the front yard, cold but clean, and in my chest, for the first time in many years, there was a real lightness, like I had finally set down something heavy I'd been carrying too long. I left the neighborhood as the sky shifted toward dusk. The old car was still parked by the curb, its body dusty out of long habit. I stood looking at it for a moment, my hand resting on the roof, feeling the metal cool under my palm. For 5 years, it had been the coat I wore to disappear from other people's eyes, to hear the truth without makeup. But that was enough now. I called another car, not to show off, but because I no longer needed to hide. When the driver arrived, I took a small bag from the trunk, closed it, and walked away without looking back. Some things need to be put back where they belong, like a chapter that has finished its job. That night I returned to my apartment downtown, a place I hadn't stepped into for a long time. The security guard in the lobby looked at me like a stranger, then suddenly recognized me. He straightened up, his voice full of respect. "Mr. Derrick." I just nodded. The elevator carried me up, the doors opening to the scent of clean wood and dried tea leaves. The apartment was quiet. Not the lonely kind, but the quiet of a place waiting for its owner to return. I set my bag down and walked slowly through each corner, like meeting myself again. My phone vibrated, a number I knew so well I didn't need to see the name. My former assistant Jonah, his voice still quick and steady. "Do you want me to set up meetings?" "I want to see them first," I said, "the people who stood with me from the beginning." The next morning, I walked into a glass building where the company name had changed a few times, but the foundation was still the one I laid. In the conference room, familiar faces returned. Some had hair gone completely gray, some now wore glasses, some stood up more slowly than before. But their eyes, when they looked at me, hadn't changed. They were the eyes that had seen me work late into the night, that had heard me talk about integrity before profit. No one asked about the soup, but I saw them notice the faint burn on my wrist, saw them glance at the corner of my eye where a trace of the splash still lingered. I didn't hide it. I rolled my sleeve up slightly while pouring coffee, letting the light fall directly on it. One of them, Henry, looked straight at it and spoke, his voice calm and cold. "You endured enough to see who they really were?" I didn't elaborate. I just said, "This scar reminds me what's worth keeping and what has to be let go." In that moment, the room seemed to exhale, not out of pity but understanding. I had come back without breaking. The scar was no longer a mark of shame. It was a medal earned by someone who had walked through the most frightening place and kept his humanity. After the meeting, I didn't sign any new contracts that day. I got into the car and told the driver to head toward the coast. In the back seat, I opened a small compartment in my bag. Inside was a thin notebook, its leather cover softened, the corners worn. On the first page was my wife Emma's handwriting. Neat, gentle, just like her. That year, before Emma passed, we had planned a trip. An unfinished trip that stayed tucked away in a drawer with promises never fulfilled. I once thought I wouldn't have the courage to open it again. But today I did. I didn't speak out loud. I whispered inside my heart, as if she were still sitting beside me. I'm going. I was no longer playing the role of a weak old father to be loved. I wasn't becoming cruel to prove strength either. I chose freedom, the freedom Emma had always wanted me to have, even when the world tried to lock me into a box called duty. As the car crossed a long bridge, sea wind struck the windows, salty and sharp. I looked at the horizon and sent Jonah a short message. Book me a trip, the exact place in the notebook, and prepare the final paperwork for Rachel. Not to punish, to end it. I set the phone down, an unfamiliar peace settling in me. But deep in my chest, something hadn't fully closed yet, like an envelope still unopened, like a question unanswered. Because I didn't know where Rachel would stand on that road when I truly returned to my own life. I left the city early one morning, when the streets were still half asleep, and the coffee shop on the corner had just turned on its lights. I didn't look back, not out of resentment, but because I had set down what needed to be set down. That city gave me many years of work, many memories, and it was also where I learned my final lesson about boundaries. I carried a light bag, Emma's notebook, and a sense of stability I once thought I'd lost. I didn't destroy anyone. They collapsed on their own when the light came on. I didn't take revenge through violence or bitterness. I simply put the truth where it belonged and stepped back. When truth stands firm, it doesn't need a guard. It does the rest on its own. On the road, I stopped at a small rest area and ordered a hot cup of coffee. I sat watching people pass by, each carrying a story. I realized I didn't need to prove anything anymore. The scar had become a medal. My silence had once been mistaken for weakness, but silence can also be strength when paired with preparation and self-respect. This story is a work of fiction, inspired by real-life situations and human experiences, meant to offer emotional value and lessons worth reflecting on. I believe silence is not always weakness. Money reveals people's true nature faster than any speech ever could. Setting boundaries isn't cruelty, but a necessity to preserve our humanity. And in real life, if you find yourself in a similar situation, seek legal support, protect yourself, talk to people you trust, and never sacrifice your dignity just to keep a toxic relationship. I continue the unfinished journey with Emma in my heart, carrying a flame that never goes out. Not a flame of anger, but a flame of clarity, of the courage to choose freedom. If this story made you think, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss future stories where those once looked down on rise in the smartest and most humane ways. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. You are not alone.